A few years ago, Lil Baby couldn't miss. Every album he touched went to #1. Every feature turned into a moment. A label executive publicly campaigned for him to win Album of the Year at the Grammys, and he actually had a case. Then, somewhere along the way, something shifted. His albums still debut at #1. The streams still come in by the hundreds of millions. But scroll through the reactions underneath any new release now, and you'll find a different mood entirely. Boredom, disappointment, people asking out loud whether he's still the same artist. So which is it? Is Lil Baby actually falling off, or is the internet just bored of a guy who's been on top for too long? Let's actually look at the evidence. To understand why this debate even exists, you have to understand how absolute his dominance used to be. Dominique Jones grew up in Atlanta, started rapping seriously after a stint in prison as a teenager, and moved fast once he got out. His 2018 debut, Harder Than Ever, went platinum. That same year, a collaborative mixtape with a rising Atlanta artist named Gunna called Drip Harder produced the single Drip Too Hard, which eventually went diamond, meaning it sold the equivalent of 10 million units and earned a Grammy nomination. The two of them together felt like the future of the genre. Then came 2020, and this is the year that made Lil Baby's name mean something bigger than just hits. His album My Turn debuted at #1, spent 5 separate weeks there, and became the best-selling album in the country for the entire year, going on to platinum certification 4 times over. In the middle of that run, during the height of the George Floyd protests, he released The Bigger Picture, a song directly addressing police brutality that became his highest-charting single as a lead artist and earned him 2 Grammy nominations. His own label head publicly criticized the Grammys for shutting My Turn out of the major categories that year, and it wasn't an unreasonable complaint. He followed all of that with a #1 collaborative album with Lil Durk in 2021 and an actual competitive Grammy win in 2022 for his feature on Kanye West and The Weeknd's Hurricane. For about 2 straight years, there was no ceiling. That's the baseline you need in your head for anything that follows to make sense, because you can't understand a fall from a height you never established. Here's a distinction worth understanding before we go any further, because it explains almost the entire debate around him right now. A #1 album and a beloved album are not the same thing, and they never have been. Billboard's chart position is driven by total consumption, streams, sales, and album equivalent units, all added together in the first week. It measures how many people pressed play, not how many people walked away satisfied. An artist with a large enough existing fan base can debut at #1 almost on autopilot, because millions of loyal streams show up in week 1 regardless of whether the album is actually good. Certifications work similarly. Gold, platinum, and diamond all measure volume over time, not quality. So when you hear that a Lil Baby album debuted at #1, that tells you his fan base is still enormous. It tells you almost nothing about whether that fan base actually liked what they heard. That gap between commercial performance and genuine reception is exactly where this entire story lives, and it shows up for the first time in October of 2022. That month, Lil Baby released his 3rd studio album, It's Only Me. It debuted at #1, pulling in close to 300 million streams in its first week alone, one of the biggest opening weeks of that entire year. But underneath the chart position, something had clearly changed. Rolling Stone's review said the album stuck to the formula that had carried him to the top, while somehow losing the personality that made his earlier work stand out. Enemy described it as a few notches short of greatness once you stripped away the polish. On Metacritic, it settled at a middling 66 out of 100, and on fan aggregation sites, plenty of listeners rated it even lower, calling it a step down from the ambition of My Turn. The backlash even showed up on the streets of Atlanta, where fans publicly protested his inclusion on a Mount Rushmore-style mural of the city's rap legends, arguing he hadn't earned the spot yet. Years later, Lil Baby himself gave the clearest explanation for why that album landed the way it did. In an interview with Complex, he admitted he hadn't wanted to release It's Only Me at all, that he wasn't in the right headspace at the time, and that the songs on it were ones he'd made without actually loving them. According to him, it was his label, Quality Control, pushing him to put out a project on their timeline rather than his own. That's a genuinely important piece of context missing from most of the online criticism. The first album that made people start questioning him wasn't necessarily a sign that he'd lost his ability. By his own account, it was a sign that the machine around him was prioritizing output over inspiration. And he went along with it anyway. A second crack, this one with nothing to do with the music itself, opened up around the same time. It was about loyalty. Gunna, his old Drip Harder partner, had been swept up in Georgia's ESL RICO case alongside Young Thug and dozens of others. After 8 months in custody, Gunna took what's known as an Alford plea, a deal where a defendant accepts a conviction while maintaining their innocence, and walked free while Young Thug and others remained behind bars for years. Online and within parts of Young Thug's own circle, that plea got read as a betrayal. Lil Baby, who'd built some of his biggest early records alongside Gunna, picked a side fast and publicly. He told an interviewer flatly that he and Gunna no longer had any relationship. Across multiple songs since, including cuts on his 2025 album Wham, he's kept referring to unnamed rats, lyrics that fans and press widely interpreted as continued shots at his former collaborator. Gunna's attorney has pushed back hard against the underlying accusation, insisting publicly that his client never cooperated against anyone. Whatever actually happened in that courtroom, the fallout was real and public, and it split the fan base. Some fans respected Lil Baby standing firm on loyalty. Others felt like watching two artists who'd made some of the decade's best duo chemistry get permanently severed over a dispute that, from the outside, nobody fully understood. Either way, it was the first time in years that Lil Baby was generating headlines that had nothing to do with a hit record. Then came Wham, released in January of 2025, and this is where the commercial versus reception gap became impossible to ignore. The album debuted at number 1, exactly like clockwork. Reception online was nothing like clockwork. Across social media, reactions ranged from lukewarm to openly hostile, with one widely shared post joking that the album couldn't survive a single car ride, another calling the whole project boring, and a third describing the experience of returning to a different major release that same week as feeling like relief by comparison. A live streamer with millions of viewers publicly reacted with visible confusion mid-listen, a clip that itself racked up its own separate wave of views and commentary. Even Billboard's own chart writers acknowledged the disconnect directly, describing the album's number 1 debut as arriving despite lukewarm fan feedback, which is a notable thing for an industry trade publication to put in print about a chart-topping release. That disconnect showed up somewhere much harder to fake than a comment section too. Large stretches of the accompanying Wham world tour ended up scrapped, including dates overseas, a sign that whatever was happening online wasn't purely a social media pile-on. People weren't just complaining. Some of them were declining to show up, and empty seats are a much harder thing for an artist's team to spin than a bad tweet. What followed made things worse, not because of the music itself, but because of a broken promise. Before Wham even dropped, Lil Baby had told fans a second, more personal project was coming right behind it, a record he described as the serious side of himself. In contrast to Wham's flashier, younger energy, he gave it a working title, Dominique, his actual first name, framing it as something more vulnerable than anything he'd released before. Fans held on to that. Then the release date moved. And moved again. By September of 2025, a cryptic post from an account tied to his management team floated the word retirement, sending fans into a spiral of speculation, some of it genuinely supportive of him stepping back, some of it reading as a fan base quietly preparing for the worst. When the album finally arrived that December on his birthday, it wasn't Dominique at all. It was called The Leaks, and true to its name, it was largely built from songs that had already circulated online for months as unfinished snippets, repackaged into a formal release. For fans who'd been promised something deeply personal, getting a collection of old leaks instead landed less like a gift and more like a shrug. One review put it bluntly, noting the album barely acknowledged the very backlash, cancelled tour dates, and mounting pressure that had defined his year, opting instead for the same brags about jewelry and cars that had drawn criticism the first time around. Now, here's where it's worth stopping and genuinely arguing the other side. Because the case against Lil Baby is not as airtight as a highlight reel of angry tweets makes it look. Start with the most basic fact: he is still debuting at number 1. In an era where audiences fragment across 1,000 microgenres and attention spans keep shrinking, that alone puts him ahead of the overwhelming majority of his peers, including plenty of artists who never once dealt with this kind of backlash simply because they never got big enough to be worth criticizing this loudly. Backlash at this scale is, in its own strange way, a form of relevance. Nobody spends this much energy being disappointed in an artist nobody cares about anymore. There's also a real argument that timing is working against him more than talent is. He arrived in 2018 and 2020 at a moment when melodic Atlanta trap had no real competition for the culture's attention. That's no longer true. Hip-hop's center of gravity has genuinely shifted since then, with a wave of younger artists and rebuilt veteran sounds crowding the exact lane he once had almost entirely to himself. When the biggest song of a given month is coming from an artist who didn't have a single charting record when My Turn came out, it changes what the future of rap even means as a title. Regardless of whether Lil Baby's own output has actually gotten worse in any objective sense, every artist's 4th or 5th album inevitably gets compared not just to whatever else drops that same year, but to the impossible standard of their own commercial peak. My Turn was, by any honest measure, a genuinely exceptional album that happened to land during one of the most socially significant moments in recent American history. Following that up was always going to be close to impossible, independent of the actual quality of what came after it. There's a structural piece of this worth examining too, one that has nothing to do with talent at all: pacing. In the years he was considered untouchable, Lil Baby was everywhere constantly, dropping loose singles, hopping on other people's tracks, staying in the conversation between albums instead of disappearing for a year at a time. That constant presence is its own kind of momentum, and once it slows down, even briefly, the algorithm-driven attention economy that made him ubiquitous in the first place starts rewarding whoever fills that gap instead. The repeated delays around Dominique and the leaks didn't just frustrate fans waiting on a specific project. They created months of silence at exactly the moment competitors were releasing constantly, and in a genre where staying visible is often treated as being relevant, that silence cost him more goodwill than a mediocre album would have on its own. And the Gunna situation cuts both ways too. Fans who are frustrated with Lil Baby over that fallout are, in a lot of cases, applying a standard to him that they don't apply nearly as harshly to other artists who've distanced themselves from former collaborators for far murkier reasons. Loyalty and grudges are both subjective, and plenty of longtime fans have publicly sided with Lil Baby's version of events rather than against it. The idea that this single controversy tanked his entire reputation gives it more explanatory power than the evidence really supports, since the Wham backlash was overwhelmingly about the music itself, not about who he was or wasn't still friends with. It's also worth asking whether some of this is simply nostalgia doing what nostalgia always does. Fans who fell in love with an artist during their absolute creative peak tend to measure everything after that peak against an idealized memory rather than the album actually in front of them. That's not unique to him. It's one of the most consistent patterns in music criticism across every genre. In every decade, and it tends to hit hardest for exactly the kind of artist Lil Baby became, one whose defining moment was tangled up with a real historical event rather than just a great record. It's genuinely difficult to separate nostalgia for the bigger picture as a song from nostalgia for the entire cultural moment it soundtracked, and that's not a fair bar to hold any follow-up release to. The same internet that's currently calling Wham one of the worst albums of the year is statistically largely made up of people who streamed it enough times to form that opinion in the first place, which says something about how much residual goodwill is still sitting underneath all the criticism, even if nobody in the replies is admitting it out loud. So where does that actually leave the debate? The honest picture is that both things appear to be true at once, and neither cancels the other out. Commercially, Lil Baby remains one of the most reliable forces in hip-hop, still capable of a guaranteed #1 debut on demand, still moving hundreds of millions of streams within days of anything he puts out. Critically and culturally, something has genuinely shifted, and it's been building for longer than most fans give it credit for, starting quietly back in 2022 rather than suddenly in 2025. It's visible in canceled tour dates, in an artist publicly admitting he released an album he didn't even believe in the gap between his own team's promises and what actually got released. And in a tone across fan spaces that's measurably different from the near-universal goodwill of 2020. None of that proves he's lost whatever made him special in the first place. It proves that the version of Lil Baby the culture fell in love with existed inside a very specific moment, one where he had the lane largely to himself. The label pressure hadn't yet outpaced the inspiration. And a song about police brutality could feel like both a career peak and a genuine cultural document at the same time. Whether what's changed since then is him, the industry around him, or an audience that fell for a specific version of an artist and never quite let him become anyone else, is not a question the streaming numbers can answer for you. So, is Lil Baby actually a different artist now, or has the internet simply outgrown the version of him it fell in love with? Let us know which side of this you land on down in the comments.